Hi everyone. This week we're going to continue talking about loops, and we're going to look at a different style of loop. Last week we looked at the for loop, and of course loops allow us to accomplish repetition in a program. Looking at this short program here, I wrote a for loop that will print 1,000 smiley faces at the console. Okay, I guess I'll run it real quickly. Alright, there are our 1,000 smiley faces. Okay, and as we said, this is a for loop, and basically this is an example of what we call counter-controlled repetition. I'm going to type that term here, counter-controlled repetition. Okay, and what we mean by that is we basically have this counter variable. In this case I called it count. You know, it doesn't have to be called count per se. It could be called x or I or counter or anything you make up. And basically this counter variable takes on an initial value, in this case 1, and then it keeps getting incremented one by one in this case up to 1,000. And the value of this variable, this count variable, is controlling the loop. And as soon as it reaches 1,000, that's it. That's the end of the loop. Okay, and then the smiley faces stop. So we call that counter-controlled repetition, and we already know how to accomplish that with the for loop. Okay, there's another style of loop that I want you to know, and it's called the while loop. So what I think I'll do is comment out this particular loop here. Okay, so that won't execute, but I'm going to redo this, rewrite the loop in a different style using a while loop. Okay, and it'll accomplish the same thing. We'll do 1,000 smiley faces. Okay, so one thing about the for loop, getting back to the for loop that we talked about last week, I like it especially for beginning students because it's really hard to mess up. The syntax is really straightforward, and you know, you really, it's hard to take a wrong turn when you're coding a for loop. Now the while loop is not quite as student friendly, so you have to be careful with it. The first thing, before you even think of typing out the loop, you have to designate a loop counter. See, with the for loop, the designating a counter is part of its basic syntax, so that's why it's hard to mess up. But with the while loop, you basically have to create a variable up front that's going to serve as your counter variable. So I will go ahead and use the word count again, and I'll start that off at 1, just like we did in the for loop. Okay, so again, I haven't even typed the loop yet, haven't even started coding the actual loop. So from the get-go, you have to designate your loop counter. And then we can dive into the syntax here. We're going to say while, that's a key word here in Small Basic, while count is less than or equal to 1,000. Okay, that's the top of the loop here. The loop is like a sandwich, so I think I'm going to end it before I do anything else. We end a loop with the word end while, so that's like the bottom piece of bread for the sandwich. Okay, and then the line of code that will write the smiley face, really the line of code that's going to be repeated, in this case, this line of code. Alright, and then one more thing that we have to do. We have to add an increment. We have to increment our counter variable. This is how we increment our counter variable. With the for loop, the increment is just kind of, it just comes with a loop, and you don't have to worry about it separately. But with the while loop, again, there's more responsibility on your shoulders to take care of some of these essentials, like the loop counter and this increment. And I'll run this without those things, or without the increment at least, and you'll see the effects. Okay, so anyway, here's a basic while loop. We start our counter variable at 1, okay, and basically the loop keeps going while the count is less than or equal to 1,000. This is a relational expression. Remember that phrase, relational expression, using our relational operator, the greater than, or the less than or equal to in this case. So basically, relational expressions, if you recall, evaluate to true or false, okay? So while count is less than or equal to 1,000, first time through count equals 1. Is 1 less than or equal to 1,000? It sure is. So when the relational expression evaluates to true, the body of the loop will execute, and we get that first smiley face, okay? And then this line executes, count equals count plus 1. So count, first time through the loop has a value of 1. If we say count equals the value that's in there plus 1, that's like saying count equals 1 plus 1, and count goes up to 2. And then we're back up at the top of the loop. Is count less than or equal to 1,000, meaning is 2 less than or equal to 1,000? It sure is. So the body of the loop will execute. So we get our second smiley face, and then count goes up to 3. And then we're back to the top of the loop. And this keeps going on and on and on 1,000 times until finally count is incremented up to 1,001. And this will evaluate to false. When count finally gets up to 1,001, then the relational expression evaluates to false, and we're out of here. The loop ends. Okay? So let me just run this so we can see the effects. Okay, again, our same 1,000 smiley faces. Okay, so, you know, I guess I like to break down while loops into, or counter-controlled repetition really, into what I call the essentials. Okay, and your first essential is that counter variable. And all the essentials have to be here, otherwise it's not going to work. Okay, so the first essential is a counter variable, and it has some sort of initial value, usually 0 or 1. Okay, you set it to typically 0 or 1. Okay, just like with the for loop. And then another essential here is the relational expression, which is like a condition or a test to test the value of the counter variable against the ending point. The ending point in this case is 1,000. And then, very importantly, we need an increment. Okay, and that's inside the body of the loop, or inside the sandwich. And that will typically increment the counter variable by 1. Okay. All right. So let me show you what happens if you forget this essential here. This is the easiest one to forget. The other ones, you really can't forget them. But this one is easy to forget. And here's what happens. Okay, so we're way beyond 1,000 smiley faces at this point. The program keeps running and running, and the smiley faces keep appearing. So this is what we call an infinite loop, or a loop that really has no end point to it, and we'll talk about why that is. If you happen to get yourself into an infinite loop like we have here, and you will, this is a very common thing to do. I still do it even in class sometimes. It's so easy to forget that increment. You can end the program here. Did you see in the lower right corner there's that end program button? Okay, so anyway, why did that happen? Well, if you're not incrementing counter, or the counter variable, count in this case, you know, we start count out at 1. And we said keep looping while count is less than or equal to 1,000. 1 is less than or equal to 1,000. And so it keeps looping. And we don't have the increment, so count isn't changing. The value isn't growing. It's never going to reach the end point, which would be 1,001. Once count reaches 1,001, the loop is over. But it's not going to get there because we don't have an increment. So one just count just stays at 1, and the relational expression just is always going to be true, because 1 is always going to be less than or equal to 1,000. Always has been, always will be till the end of time. So that's a pitfall that you want to avoid.